All right, I am super excited to talk with Craig Kasper, a New York City doctor who specializes in hearing and balance disorders. Now, Craig is an incredibly smart man. He has a master's degree from the University of Buffalo, a doctorate from the University of Florida, and he performed a clinical fellowship at the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York City. Now, similar to Robbie and myself, Craig was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 27 in 1999. In the early 2000s, he started to share his message about health on major television networks and all around the country. And he launched The Bravest, a podcast to explore what motivates us to flip the switch to live our best life. Much like Robbie and myself, Craig also loves to interact and learn from other people who are living with diabetes and beyond. People who have experienced adversity in their lives to spread a positive message and empower those people to create the healthiest version of themselves. So thanks for taking the time to be with us here today, Craig.
I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and it's great to connect with you.
In today's talk, we're going to cover a lot of ground about specifically diabetes, but then also we'll talk about things unrelated to diabetes as well, because you seem to have a really good background on many things here. So I'd like to start here at the beginning here. If we can kind of like go back to your childhood, I really like to learn who people are when they're children, because I think it influences who they are as adults. So let's go back to your childhood and let's try and understand what set the stage for who you are today.
I love that question. Yeah, so I'm from New York. My family goes back in New York City well over 100 years. And I was born in New York, but I didn't live in Manhattan, actually. I grew up in Queens, which is just outside of Manhattan. And at a pretty young age, we moved just north of Manhattan to the suburbs. Now, my childhood was definitely filled with a lot of sports. It was filled with a lot of music. I was actually a bass player in a hardcore punk band when I was a kid, so that definitely shaped my mentality a little bit. I was also very much into alternative sports before the X Games was even a thing. So I was a skateboarder, spent a lot of time propelling myself off of launch ramps. I also was a flatland freestyle bike rider also. Have some nice scars to show all of the work that I've done, figuring out how to do tricks the right way. So my childhood was definitely filled with a lot of music, a lot of sports, a lot of creativity was involved as well. And as an aside, I was also a lacrosse player, which was my first entry point into formal team sports, which is totally different than some of the things I was involved in before, and actual formal training, which definitely carried over into my adult life. Lacrosse is a pretty violent sport too. So I was an attackman, and the defensive men were oftentimes coming to get the ball from me. So I learned very quickly how to take a hit and to tolerate pain. So the concept of perseverance and grit was really developed during those earlier years through the falls on my skateboard and the nice hits that I took as an attackman. But that definitely shaped my mindset, I think, into adulthood to be more willing to take adversity and try to figure out how to turn it into something that's a little bit more positive.
Yeah, which also becomes a metaphor now for, how you're living your life with diabetes. So this is a perfect transition here. You were diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 27. So type 1 diabetes in your late 20s back in 1999, which is a lot later than most people develop type 1 diabetes. So tell us about your diagnosis story.
Yeah, so everybody has their story, and it definitely shapes the way that we live our lives and kind of our mentality. I wouldn't say that my story is necessarily unique. I was a young clinician starting at one of the largest teaching hospitals in the city. I spent a lot of time at work. There's a lot of stress. Interestingly enough, what I do for a living as an audiologist is I focus on hearing and balance disorders. And at the time, I actually had a sudden hearing loss, which for most people, that's a direct result of some sort of a viral infection. So standard treatment for that is antivirals. I was given a very powerful steroid also, and it stressed me out quite a bit, physically as well as emotionally. I actually noticed under my left eye one morning as I was getting ready for work, a black spot, and I thought I was hallucinating actually. Turns out what I ended up having was something called the central serous retinopathy, which is just a leak under the retina. And the ophthalmologist at the hospital who tested me, they asked me what I did for a living, because usually that's only seen in people who have very high stress jobs. And it's a result of that. So to this day, I actually have some impacts of that visual disturbance on my left eye. But in the weeks that followed that, other things started to happen to me, which I kind of chalked up to the stress of just being a clinician and a young professional in a big city. Uh, I, I was, if you could picture this, I was about 205 pounds, 6'2", working out. So I was in pretty decent shape. And within a period of 4 weeks, I lost 30 pounds.
4 weeks, lost 30 pounds. Wow,
Yeah.
that's tremendous.
I was eating a tremendous amount of food. I was drinking more water than I can potentially consume, anybody would want to consume, and I'm still thirsty. So all the classic symptoms now looking back, right? Um, and it didn't really hit me. So look, I look at this from a perspective as a healthcare provider also. I can remember working in the hospital, and you'd see a cardiologist on their lunch break eating a hot dog, or the oncologist after they just worked with Mrs. Jones, who had lung cancer, smoking cigarette outside on their break. It just doesn't calculate, right? And
Right.
the one thing that I've come to realize is that as healthcare providers, oftentimes we're really good, and it's very well meaning in terms of the advice and the information we're giving our patients, but oftentimes we don't take our own advice in terms of taking care of our own health. And I was definitely guilty of that. Um, it didn't hit me until one morning taking the subway in New York City to work, and I literally was hallucinating on the platform, and I felt scared for the first time. So I went into the office. I had one of my colleagues draw some blood, and he said, "Look, we'll see what happens." Within a few hours, called me back. He says, "You have to get to the emergency room immediately." My blood sugars were over 800, and at that point it clicked, and I said, "Okay, emergency room, here we come. First shot of insulin, pump me full of IV fluids to rehydrate me." It felt like $1,000,000 within the next. It was amazing. You don't realize how cruddy you feel, because it happens so slowly over the course of time, right? You slowly
Absolutely.
deteriorate. You don't realize how bad you feel until you start to feel good again. And I started to finally feel good again.
Right. So at that time, did you know anything about type 1 diabetes, or was this almost like a foreign
Zero.
word to you?
Yeah. Diabetes, as it is for most people, is just a blanket statement, right? And diabetes is not diabetes is not diabetes. Now we know there's many different flavors, and in each individual person, it's very different for you, for me, for anyone else. I was actually misdiagnosed as a type 2 diabetic because of my age. And then once I had a second opinion and we had all the antibodies tested, and it was clear that I was a late onset type 1. And look, it was that moment. I spent the week in the hospital, and just like everyone else, we have to learn how to test our blood sugars, make sure our nutrition is in check. The freakiest thing was giving myself an injection for the first time, as I'm sure it's the same story for everyone. And for me, I used it as an opportunity to say, okay, this is an opportunity for me to figure out where's the bright spot here. What can I do with this right now? And how is this going to change my life for the better? And thinking back, and as I was kind of developing the concept of the bravest life, the bravest podcast, it really started in that hospital bed that week when I was trying to pull myself together. How do I make myself better, stronger, smarter, faster, despite this? So fast forward, here we are, and it's close to 18 years at this point, and it's been an amazing ride. It really has.
Yeah, it's actually really cool to hear you say that, because a lot of people, when they're diagnosed with any form of diabetes, whether type 1, prediabetes, type 2, gestational diabetes, the first sort of psychological process that happens is like, woe is me, looks like, it can become a grim story very quickly. But you took a different spin on it, and you said, okay, I have type 1 diabetes now. I can live with this, first of all. And not only can I live with it, but I'm going to excel with it. So is
Yeah.
that something do you just have an optimistic perspective on life, and that's kind of the way that you flip around a lot of adverse situations, or was this one different for some reason?
I would love to say that I'm the most optimistic person on the planet, but if I were to be honest with you, I would say no. Um, I would say that from my perspective, I have a tendency when things get very stressful. So if there's some sort of urgency, or if somebody's there's an issue that has to be dealt with. Look, I lived through 9/11 in New York City. I have a tendency to actually get very calm in those situations, and I think I actually act my best when there's adversity. I think a little more clearly. So, look, I would be lying to you if I said that I didn't have my down moments. I think anybody who's dealing with the chronic nature of any sort of disease, disorder, such as diabetes, right? Um, we're down on ourselves a lot. For me to say that never happens, I would totally be lying. Look, I think that we live and die by the blood sugar reading, right? And if before I had my continuous glucose monitor, I would take a blood stick, finger stick, and if my blood sugars were elevated, it would immediately send me, oh my God, what am I doing wrong? So I would say that I have the ability to take a look at the situation and say, okay, despite this, yes, how can we make a positive out of it? But I'm not Mr. Optimistic all the time by any means. I wish I was. I really do.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, at least you ended up with a very optimistic perspective on it.
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. You have to. You have to, because if you don't, look, this is our reality. And the way that I look at it is I'm probably the healthiest that I've ever been because we are the quantified self right now. Just like everyone is talking about this in other areas of fitness and wellness, we're all wearing our smartwatches that can quantify steps and all of that. Look, we're getting our blood sugars tested, our HbA1cs on a regular basis. We have continuous glucose monitors at our disposal. These are remarkable things that help us to understand where we are at any given point. How do you be negative about that? It's like I have the ability to stay as healthy as possible because of the technology that's around me, and I'm just constantly working on mindset to figure out how I can do better today than I did yesterday. And again, that's the kind of the core of this passion project that we'll be talking about shortly as well.
Absolutely. I love it. Okay. So you're a healthcare provider in New York City and you specialize in hearing and balance disorders. So
Yeah.
is there a link between diabetes and hearing disorders?
Yes, there definitely is, and this is something that I love this question. It's been kind of I've been on the pedestal or the platform talking about this for a long time. Look, when we go to our endocrinologists or our primary care doctor or nurse practitioners, anyone who's taking care of us and monitoring our diabetes from a healthcare perspective, there's a lot of measurements that they're going to make on a regular basis to make sure that we're as healthy as possible. So for instance, you want to make sure you're getting your HbA1cs. We want to make sure we're checking things like kidney function. We want to make sure that we're getting a dilated retinal exam once a year. We want to make sure that peripheral neuropathy is not something that's impacting us on a negative basis because that can happen. I would I would be willing to pay a lot of money if your physicians mention anything about hearing health. And if they do, they're super special people that are totally in tune. And it's not because they don't want us to think about it. It's just it's not on the radar for most healthcare providers. It's the invisible disease, right? People can live without hearing, and nobody would really know necessarily. You can't see a hearing loss.
Right.
So, from a perspective of diabetes, people who have diabetes are twice as likely to have hearing loss than our non-diabetic peers. And there's a lot of research that's shown that. And the reason is because when we take a look at all of the things that could potentially impact, say, our vision, our kidneys, peripheral neuropathy, it all stems from blood flow, capillaries, right? The tiny little uh, blood vessels that supply nutrients to our end organs. Those become compromised if we have blood sugar levels that are elevated on a regular basis. The inner ear, which is called the cochlea, it has all these tens of thousands of little hair cells in it. That is a highly vascularized part of our body. There's a lot of blood flow supplied by capillaries. Once those capillaries become compromised, they don't provide the nutrients to the inner ear. The inner ear cells start to die off. And when they do, we cannot grow them back. We can't replace them. And we experience hearing loss. So what I am hoping for, and this is something that we're actually launching in our practice, is something called the Diabetes Hearing Project, where we're trying to educate the physicians, the endocrinologists, patients, loved ones about the importance of having our hearing screened on a regular basis, just like we have our vision tested and just like we have our HbA1c. It's critical. It really is, because hearing loss, although it's not life-threatening in any way, it's life-altering. If you have hearing loss, we're disconnected from our environment. It impacts our brain. So it's really, really important to have our hearing tested when we have diabetes as well.
You know, you're actually the first person I've ever talked with who's talked about the connection between diabetes and hearing, because you read it all over the internet. You see, you know, if you have diabetes, any form of diabetes, and elevated blood glucose, then you're at risk for heart disease, liver damage, kidney failure, retinopathy, nerve damage. And you see about these complications of diabetes. Personally, I've never read anything about hearing loss. And so I'm really glad to hear you mention it here and give us the research, because you know, like you're saying, it's life altering. Minimizing you know, not being able to hear properly is something that will definitely negatively impact your life. And I didn't know that you actually are twice as likely to develop hearing loss as the general population.
Yeah, it's a scary statistic, but it's true.
It's incredible. Okay. So now, in parallel with your clinical work, you've also launched a website called The Bravest Life, as well as a podcast called The Bravest Podcast. So explain to our listeners here, what is the purpose? What is your mission with both your website as well as the podcast?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking about that. This has been a passion project of mine for some time. And look, it's something that stems from personal needs. And the reason why I say that is I have questions constantly. And I think I'm a pretty educated person when it comes to my health, but I definitely don't know everything. But I have these questions that I'm constantly trying to figure out the answers to when it comes to my own health, my wellness, fitness, athletics, um, anything related to how my diabetes might impact me for the long term, right? So I am just, as I said before, I'm really interested in figuring out how I could potentially be better today than I was yesterday. And that's what really kind of served as the catalyst for the bravestlife.com, the website, and then the podcast that we're going to be launching shortly. I'm really interested in understanding how people overcome difficult situations and how they overcome adversity. You know, there's a concept of our mindset, right? And I'm not sure if you're familiar with a researcher, a psychologist. Her name is Carol Dweck, PhD. She was actually at Columbia for a period of time. I think she's out at Stanford now, if I'm not mistaken. This concept of fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And with our health, as is anything else in our life, we might be able to view, okay, we're stuck in this little box. There's no way it's going to get any better. There's nothing that I'm going to do that's going to improve my situation. I'm a victim of my circumstances, essentially, versus the person who takes a look at a challenge from a growth mindset, where they'll say, look, where's the opportunity that's embedded in this challenge? How do I overcome it? How do I become bigger, better, stronger, faster, smarter, whatever it might be, despite that obstacle? And I pulled that and I take a look at how we deal with diabetes on a day-to-day basis, because we are a constant science experiment. Sometimes no matter what we do, no matter how healthy we eat, no matter how much we exercise, our blood sugars are not agreeing with us for some reason. And we may never figure out exactly why that's the case. We just kind of look at it, okay, how do we learn from this experience and move on? So taking that concept of adversity and developing this concept of the website and the podcast, I really want to learn from people. I want to learn the answers to the questions that I don't have, and then ultimately taking that information, putting it together, and helping other people along that journey to understand, okay, how do we eat healthier? You guys are great at that. I've been a big fan of what you guys have been doing for such a long time. A long time in the internet age is 2 years, right? But I've been a big fan of what you guys are doing. And there's a lot of really interesting people there within the diabetes community that can help me and help others, whether it's eat better, how do we exercise smarter, how do I learn how to run my first marathon, and I've spoken to athletes, type 1 athletes, who've done amazing things. How do we look at that as inspiration, right? How do we look at that as motivation to flip the switch and say, if they can do it, of course I can do it as well. but it goes well beyond the education, the inspiration, and the motivation. It has to translate to action. And that's really where the sweet spot is here. We can listen to people like you and I talk all day long, and at the end of the day, it sounds great, but we don't do anything about it.
Right.
So that's really what I'm looking for is, okay, how do we figure out how to help people move to that next level and then ultimately lead the healthiest version of themselves? And then taking that even a step further is once we are living that healthy version, how do we help them make an impact on the world around them? Because if we're not healthy, we can't do great things in the world, right? We
Absolutely.
have to be at our healthiest version of ourselves to really impact the world. And I don't only want to talk to people who are in the diabetes community. I think there's stuff outside that we can bring in can ultimately help us live that healthy life. So that's really the passion that I have for it is figuring out one, how I can help myself live a healthier life and make a bigger impact, but ultimately helping others do the same, but elevating people like yourself, like Robbie, and like other people in the community. So we all have this platform to just kind of work together. So that's really the goal there.
I love this. This is great, actually. You know, there's a lot of people that we coach, and a lot of people that we interact with on the internet who understand that they, in order to provide care for their kids, in order to provide care for their family, that they need to take care of themselves. But like you're saying, it can be a challenge. It can be a struggle to make changes to your diet, make changes to your exercise program, make changes to the way that you think, make changes to the way that you interact with the world. And I think a lot of people interpret it as though if I'm going to work on me, I'm being selfish. Because ultimately what I want to do is I want to help other people. I want to help my kids. I want to make sure that they grow up to be wonderful people. I want to, help my friends and family around me. And it almost feels like for a lot of people, if they are to put attention and focus on themselves, that they're being selfish.
Yeah,
And what you're saying here is almost the exact opposite, which is that in order to provide care to others, in order to interact with the world, it's necessary to be the best version of ourselves first. And once we are that best version, then we can go out and we can actually help and benefit others.
perfect. That was so well articulated. And look, I live this every single day. You have to, it's not about making monstrous changes every day, right? And I'm sure that you guys talk about this as well. It's how do we create sustainable change over time? And usually that occurs through incremental changes every single day, right?
Right.
That's how we sustain a healthier lifestyle. Look, I have two kids, I have a practice, I have a commute, I have a wife, I have all these wonderful things in my life. But at the end of the day, if I don't wake up at 5 o'clock every single day to get to the gym, I don't get my workout in. If I don't spend time figuring out where I can fit in my mindfulness practice or my meditation, I know that I am not going to be able to present myself to the world, whether it's to my family or to the patients that I care for every single day, the best version of myself possible. So you're right, it might seem selfish on the surface when we look at it, but if we really look at the bigger picture, it's so selfless, right? It's so selfless.
Yeah, it's a great way to think about it, actually. So going off of what you just said here, you have a mindfulness practice. You've adopted that in your life over the past 17 years. So can you tell us a little bit about your mindfulness practice and what you know about the actual neurological, the neuroscience changes that occur as a result of adopting a mindful practice?
Sure. So mindfulness for me started back in graduate school, and I don't think I really understood what I was doing at the time, but I knew that I was under a lot of stress, master's program, tests, practicals, whatever it might be. And I would spend time in quiet contemplation, um, just kind of finding space. And for me at that time, I think that was the start of my mindfulness practice. I didn't revisit it again until after my diagnosis with type 1. And I wanted to figure out ways to de stress, for lack of a better term. And the first thing I came across was a CD about, and it was a guided meditation of sorts, walking you through progressive muscle relaxation, which is just kind of tightening and releasing different parts of your body until you work your way from your toes all the way up to your head. I found that super helpful. And then from there, it kind of rolled into, because I have the science background, I said, okay, I need to understand. This is when meditation was still kind of hokey, right? Um, I wanted to look at the science behind it because I was really looking for ways to bring this into my clinical practice for some of my patients. So I started reading a physician's book. This guy's by the name of Herbert Benson. He was a medical doctor up at Harvard. And I said, okay, if this guy can write a book on mindfulness, then there has to be some sort of validity behind it. And I highly recommend anybody take a look. It's in paperback now. This thing has been in its probably 8th or 10th printing. But the book's called The Relaxation Response, which is the exact opposite of the fight or flight response, which is the stress response. He talked about basically all of the things that happen in our body when we're under stress. And it rolled into people like John Kabat-Zinn, who's a PhD psychologist, further looking at the science behind meditation, mindfulness-based stress reduction is something that he created. Long story short, I came at it from a scientific perspective, looking at brain function, looking at how the mind changes, but more importantly, how the physiology, or equally as important is how the physiology changes. What happens when we're under stress is that our cortisol levels, along with a whole bunch of other hormones, elevate because it prepares us to either fight or run away from something that might be causing danger to us. Nowadays, we don't have very many things we have to fight off, but we're under a lot of stress, whether it's traffic, work, financial, diabetes being another one. But the other thing that occurs is that our body starts to flood glucose into our system to prepare it, to give it energy in order to fight or flight. So what I found is that if I started to integrate some sort of mindfulness practice in my life, my blood sugars were actually better than if I didn't, and I was lax about it, and I was stressed out for a long period of time. So there is definitely some science behind it. I'm sure it impacts people differently. For me personally, I try to get at least 15 minutes a day. If I could do more, that's great. But that helps me to kind of unravel that stress response as much as possible. But what I've also found is it also provides me with a little bit of space between something that might occur in my world and my reaction to it. Mindfulness practice is really important to combat that stress response.
For a lot of people, I think there's this sort of disconnect between the fact that you, from an intellectual perspective, you know that what you just said is a true statement. If you adopt a mindful practice, a mindfulness practice, it will reduce your stress levels. That will in turn indirectly benefit your diabetes health. It potentially could bring your blood glucose down. It could bring your insulin use down. It could use your oral medications down. But actually translating that into action can be the hard part. So suppose I came up to you and I said, hey, I've never done meditation before. I don't know where to start. What recommendation would you give to me to actually kick this motion into progress?
Sure. First thing I'll come across as saying I'm not a professional mindfulness teacher. So,
Sure.
and the reality is I don't think that we have to be necessarily because there's such simple things that we can do immediately that will help us to combat that fight or flight response. First thing that I would say is that most people say I don't have time for meditation, which you don't need an hour. You don't have to sit cross-legged on a mountaintop somewhere to practice meditation. You need 5 minutes in the morning if you could potentially get it. And if we can't wake up 5 minutes earlier than our alarm clock, then we're really not committed to much of anything, right? It's just an extra 5 minutes. So just even 5 minutes a day, just to focus on our breathing will help. Other people say, well, should my mind just be completely blank? I have constant thoughts coming through my mind. That's not the basis for meditation. The basis for meditation is non-reactivity to those thoughts. It's just letting them be. So I would say 5 minutes a day to start. Find at some point in your time. It could be on your commute in. It could be while you're having your coffee, just mindfully drinking your coffee and thinking about it versus playing on the phone. Putting the phone down is such an important thing. If you think about the stress response that our phones alone cause from the constant alerts, from the nonstop, and I'm guilty. I'm not perfect by any means. I love Instagram. I love all the social media stuff. We're constantly checking our phones. If we just have the ability to shut them off and keep them out of our bedroom at night, get a better sleep, that's going to help us alone. But 5 minutes a day of just concentrating, focusing on our breathing is more than enough to begin. And then there's a lot of apps out there that can help with guided meditations if you really get into it. And they're all over the place. I don't want to come across as saying that one is better than the other. Any time that you can take just for yourself and just breathe is going to help you.
That's a great call, actually. I didn't really catch all of that because I was playing on my phone at the time.
I'm sorry, hold on, my phone is ringing.
Yeah, sorry. No, this is actually really important because I think that a lot of people, myself included, overcomplicate the process of adopting a mindfulness practice. And I'm just as guilty as anyone else of saying, I don't have the time. And most importantly, I usually say I don't know what to do. So I'm going to do exactly what you just said here, which is I'm going to take 5 minutes to begin with, and I'm just going to pay attention to my breath, and that's it. And then I'm just going to not judge the thoughts that are coming into my head, because trust me, there's plenty of them. And I think this is actually gold advice, because from that, I mean, that's the starting point, right? And then from that process, is the next step in the process to sort of increase the amount of time that an individual is spending, adopting a mindful practice?
I think what's interesting is it's not only about the formal sitting time that I've found, and this is what I've learned. It's about how do you take that time, even if it's 5 minutes, cumulative over time, whatever the time is that you're taking on the cushion, they call it. But really more importantly is how do you translate that into your day-to-day, moment by moment, right? Because ultimately what we end up doing is we spend more of our day being mindless. Like, I don't even remember, sometimes I'll drive in my car, sometimes I don't even remember my commute
Right.
because I'm on autopilot. The key is really how do we translate that into what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, moment by moment, and being as present as possible without judging what's going on in our environment. That's the ultimate key, I think. And as time goes forward, we get better and better at it. But I am far from enlightened. I am working hard on that every single day, which is the complete opposite of what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to just let it happen. Uh, but I think that anything that we can do, it's again these incremental changes that we can implement in our lives, because nobody likes big sweeping changes. It doesn't stick, right?
Correct.
It's a matter of how do we make these small changes every day to impact our lives for the better. And I think just 5 minutes a day, and you'll see the benefits over time. At least I did, and I can only speak for myself, really.
Right. Okay. So let's go off of that now. You said that when you adopted a mindfulness practice, it benefited your diabetes life. So can you kind of give us a little concrete example here of what changes you noticed as far as diabetes health is concerned?
Something I alluded before was the reactivity to blood glucose readings, right? I had a significant response if it was good or bad, meaning if actually not good, if it was low or high, out of range, let's say. And for me, I've lessened that response. I'm not so hard on myself necessarily. I realize, okay, I think about what I did, or what I could have done, what I didn't do to maybe change the situation. And if it's out of my control, then okay, let's move on. What I did see and what I do see is when I am more consistent with my mindfulness practice, my blood sugars are much better. There's no doubt. Um, I could, again, from personal experience, I don't have these dramatic swings that I would have. Um, I think that that's the most concrete example that I can give, and it's a quantifiable example. Is my blood sugars definitely are better as a result of it.
That's great. Yeah. So that's actually really important, because there's many routes that an individual can take to achieving better blood glucose, whether it's adopting, from our experience, a plant-based diet, a low-fat plant-based diet, whether it's increasing your total activity, whether it's adopting a mindfulness practice, whether it's getting better quality sleep. There's so many little puzzle pieces that you can construct to create a system whereby your blood glucose is under control. And this is, I think, one of
Yeah.
those puzzle pieces that's not just, it's just not a small puzzle piece at all. This is a big and very significant puzzle piece. And I think that I'm actually glad you're bringing it to my attention and bringing it to the attention of our listeners, because I think it's a puzzle piece that many people overlook. And
100%.
it's really, really pivotal. And so I appreciate you bringing this attention towards this.
I think something like mindfulness practice and meditation, it's mainstream at this point. It's not something that is seen. There's a lot of research behind it. There's a lot of neuroscience behind it. We know that people who meditate, their brains are different than people who don't. We know that we're just better people, and we have the potential to be better people, kinder people, to ourselves, not only to people around us when we incorporate this into our lives. So yeah, I think it's such an important puzzle piece, as you said. And I really hope that more and more people start to adopt it. I think it'll help them.
Final question here I want to ask you here is, if you had to give our listeners one piece of advice, just one piece of advice about what they could do to improve their quality of life living with diabetes, what would that one piece of advice be?
I would say that it's important for us, regardless of what stage we're at, whether we were just diagnosed, and it's probably even more important when we're just diagnosed, what I'm about to say, is try not to look at the diagnosis of diabetes as a life sentence. A lot of folks will take a look at any chronic illness as being trapped to a certain extent. There is true opportunity in there. There's an opportunity to be a better version of ourselves than we might have been if we were not diagnosed with diabetes. We have the ability to we're being forced to a certain extent to live a healthier life. We're being forced to be kinder to ourselves and to be, as we talked about, more selfish, but that helps us be more selfless in the long run. So what I would encourage people to do is look at these types of things as not as obstacles, but as opportunities for every aspect of our life. And every day look for the opportunity.
I couldn't have said it better. That's brilliant. I love this.
I appreciate
I
that.
love your optimistic attitude. I really do. I can see it when you're talking. I can hear it in your words that you really, truly do believe, in the fact that you can turn adversity into something that's a truly inspiring and positive message, not only for yourself, but for other people. So personally, I respect you immensely.
Oh, I appreciate that. Hey, well, look, here's the thing. I'm working hard on that every single day. And I think that's the joy of life. That's the journey there, is how do we make ourselves better every single day? And how do we impact as many people as possible? And just to kind of throw it back at you, I'm truly inspired by what you and Robbie are doing as well. You guys are making a huge difference in people's lives. There's no doubt. And you're down in the trenches. And I would hope that one day that I would be able to make that kind of impact as well. So hats off to you guys as well.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. So this is an opportunity now. Plug yourself. Tell our listeners, how are they going to find your podcast? How are they going to find your website? Tell us all the details, because I want, people that are following us to also start to follow you as well.
Oh, that's so awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So the website is thebravestlife, all spelled out.com. The podcast will be on there as well. We'll be launching we're in the process now of just kind of packaging the first few episodes just to kind of launch them all at the same time. But that'll be launched within the next couple of weeks. So definitely look for that on the website. In terms of social media, best place to find me on social media, as I said before, I'm a big fan of Instagram. I love pictures. Craig Kasper, CraigKasper. And you'll find all about me on there as well. And if you guys happen to be in New York, and if you are diabetic or know someone who's a diabetic, our practice is New York Hearing Doctors. You can definitely find us online as well.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. When do you think that the podcast is going to be launching?
The next couple of weeks. Yeah. So we've already recorded really amazing stuff. Type 1 athletes, triathletes. First guest is amazing. The guests after that are even more amazing. But we're going to be diving in with the athletes. We're going to be talking about nutrition. And we're also talking with a PhD type 1 psychologist who works specifically with folks who have diabetes, and talking about mindset even more, which I'm really excited about because I love the neuroscience behind it. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just for clarification, your podcast is not necessarily only focused on diabetes. There's a diabetes component, but it's also applicable to a non-diabetes audience as well. Is that right?
that's a great point. Yeah. So the core right now is definitely looking at this concept of overcoming obstacles with the lens of diabetes.
Got it.
So that's really where I'm focusing the efforts in terms of the information, the education, is really focusing on our fellow community members within the world of diabetes. Where it goes outside of that, I think it definitely will apply, and people who don't have diabetes, whether it's the parents of someone who's impacted or anybody who's outside of, like, really between our diet, our nutrition, our physical activity, we try to lead pretty optimal lives. And I think that would apply to anybody, whether or not they have diabetes. But my real core focus is helping people who are within our world.
I know you're a busy guy, Craig. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did here as well. So we look forward to doing a lot more work with you in the near future. So thanks again for
That's
your time.
awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll see you guys soon.